"Look, officer, I genuinely didn't break her windows," I said, leaning against the heavy oak frame of my front door, both hands wrapped around a massive, chipped ceramic mug of black coffee that was rapidly going cold in the crisp Arizona morning air. "Physics broke her windows. I'm just a guy sitting in his living room, minding my own business, enjoying the soothing, legally compliant sounds of indoor wind chimes." The cop, a guy who looked like he hadn't slept since 2019, just stared at his handheld decibel meter. He tapped the digital screen with a thick, calloused thumb, almost like he expected the numbers to suddenly change if he hit it hard enough. He sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that carried the weight of 1,000 useless noise complaints. "Sir," he started, his voice a gravelly monotone that suggested he'd much rather be writing parking tickets or literally anywhere else in the greater Sedona municipal area. "She's claiming you used some kind of sonic weapon." "Sonic weapon?" I let out a sharp, bark-like laugh, taking a slow sip of the bitter coffee. "Officer, if her contractor decided to save a few bucks by installing cheap, developer-grade double-paned glass that couldn't handle the key of E-flat drifting across the property line, that's really an issue for her, her insurance company, and maybe a structural engineer. But me? I'm just an enthusiast of ambient, low-frequency and atmospheric resonance." He blinked slowly. The radio on his shoulder squawked with static, spitting out some garbled dispatcher code that he completely ignored. He looked over his shoulder, past my meticulously raked gravel driveway, across the perfectly manicured strip of drought-resistant succulents that separated our properties, and toward the house next door. Over there, standing on her pristine, dust-free porch, was Brenda. Brenda, the president of the Whispering Canyons Homeowners Association. Brenda, a woman whose entire personality could be summed up by a color-coded clipboard and a profound, desperate need to control the micro-actions of every living organism within a 3-mile radius. She was currently wearing a pastel pink tracksuit and pointing a trembling, manicured finger at my house, looking like a furious flamingo that had just been denied entry to a country club. Behind her, the massive, custom-built picture window of her living room was completely, utterly obliterated. It wasn't just cracked, it looked like a frozen waterfall of shattered ice, millions of tiny, spider-webbed fractures holding onto the frame by nothing but structural tension and sheer luck. "So," the cop said, turning his attention back to me, the digital meter still reading a perfectly legal, completely mundane 58 decibels. "You're telling me you didn't throw a rock?" "I am telling you, officer," I smiled, taking another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, "that I didn't lay a single finger on her property. You checked the meter yourself. I am completely within the law. I am a model citizen of Whispering Canyons. To understand how a set of antique brass wind chimes ended up causing $3,000 worth of property damage without ever technically breaking a single municipal ordinance, you have to understand the specific, agonizing ecosystem of Sedona, Arizona. Sedona isn't just a place, it's a vibe. It's a town surrounded by towering, breathtaking red rock formations that look like they were carved by ancient gods, and populated almost entirely by people who think holding a piece of rose quartz to their forehead will cure their seasonal allergies. It's beautiful, it's expensive, and it is regulated to an inch of its life. When I bought my house in Whispering Canyons, I wasn't looking for spiritual enlightenment. I was just looking for a quiet place to work remotely, a house with a decent sunroom, and a backyard where I could drink a beer without staring at a brick wall. I work in software QA, which essentially means my entire professional life consists of looking for tiny, microscopic flaws in complex systems and pointing them out until they get fixed. It's tedious, it requires an obsessive attention to detail, and it makes you incredibly cynical about the way rules are written. Whispering Canyons was built on rules. The HOA bylaws were a 60-page, leather-bound manifesto of suburban oppression. Houses could only be painted one of 3 pre-approved shades of desert neutral, which were basically just different words for dirt. You couldn't park a truck in your own driveway for more than 4 hours. Your mailbox had to be exactly 42 inches from the curb, not 41, not 43, so? And you were absolutely, unequivocally forbidden from displaying any lawn ornaments, flags, or visual disruptions that didn't align with the community's harmonious desert aesthetic. I didn't care about most of it. I kept my head down. I worked my hours, I drank my cold brew coffee, and I spent my evenings sitting on my back patio, watching the sun set over the red rocks. The only personal touch I brought to the exterior of the house was a set of wind chimes. They weren't just any wind chimes. They were heavy, solid brass cylinders, forged sometime in the 1970s, passed down to me by my late grandfather. They were heavy enough that it took a significant gust of wind to even move them, but when they did catch the breeze, they didn't tinkle like cheap glass or aluminum. They hummed. They produced a deep, resonant baritone chime that felt less like a sound and more like a physical presence in the air. I loved them. I hung them from the heavy wooden pergola over my back patio, directly outside my home office window. For 6 months, there was peace. The chimes would hum occasionally during the late afternoon winds. I would write bug reports. And life in the desert was quiet. Until Brenda decided that my grandfather's chimes were a threat to her spiritual equilibrium. It happened on a Tuesday. I was in the middle of a brutal, hour-long Zoom call with a development team that couldn't understand why their payment gateway kept crashing, when I saw a flash of pastel pink marching up my driveway. I muted my microphone, leaned back in my ergonomic desk chair, and watched through the window as Brenda bypassed my front door entirely. She unlatched my wooden side gate, marched into my backyard without hesitation, and stopped directly under the pergola. She stood there, hands planted firmly on her hips, staring up at the brass chimes like they were an offending piece of modern art. She pulled a yellow tape measure out of her pocket, extended it, and seemed to measure the distance from the chimes to the property line. I sighed, told the dev team I had to step away for a local hardware emergency, and walked out the back door. "Can I help you, Brenda?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. She spun around, completely unfazed by the fact that she was trespassing. She pulled a laminated yellow slip of paper from her pocket, the dreaded Whispering Canyons citation form. "These," she said, pointing at the brass cylinders, "are a violation." "They're wind chimes, Brenda." "They are a noise-making apparatus," she corrected, her voice dripping with that specific condescending tone usually reserved for talking to toddlers or golden retrievers. "And they are disrupting my aura." "Your aura," I repeated, crossing my arms over my chest. "Yes, my aura. Furthermore," she tapped the laminated slip with her fingernail, "they are in direct violation of Section 4, Paragraph B of the Whispering Canyons Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions. No outdoor noise-making devices audible beyond the property line. Period." I looked at the chimes. "Brenda, they barely make a sound unless the wind is blowing over 20 miles an hour. And even then, it's a low hum. It's relaxing." "Relaxation is subjective," she snapped, stepping closer, her expensive floral perfume aggressively invading my personal space. What isn't subjective are the rules. I was sitting on my patio yesterday, trying to guide my meditation group through a chakra cleansing exercise, and every time the wind blew, it sounded like a Tibetan monastery was rolling down a hill. It is unacceptable. A Tibetan monastery rolling down a hill? I couldn't help it. I laughed. That's oddly poetic for you, Brenda. Her eyes narrowed. She hated being mocked. You have 24 hours to remove the apparatus, or you will be fined $500 for the first offense, and an additional $100 for every day they remain in place. She shoved the laminated yellow slip against my chest. I didn't reach for it, so it fluttered to the ground, landing in the decorative gravel. 24 hours, she repeated, turning on her heel and marching back toward the gate. Have a harmonious day. I watched her walk away, leaving my gate wide open, of course. I bent down, picked up the yellow citation slip, and read it. It was completely filled out, citing Section 4, Paragraph B. I didn't get mad. Getting mad is what people like Brenda want. They feed on the conflict. It justifies their authority. Instead of getting mad, I felt a familiar, cold, hyper-focused sensation wash over me. It was the same feeling I got when I found a massive, glaring vulnerability in a piece of software code. She wanted to play by the rules. She wanted to weaponize the 60-page HOA manifesto against me over a family heirloom. Fine. I went back inside, sat down at my desk, and opened my laptop. I didn't go back to the Zoom call. Instead, I pulled up the Whispering Canyon's digital portal and downloaded the complete, unabridged version of the HOA covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I read Section 4, Paragraph B. No outdoor noise-making devices, including but not limited to electronic speakers, OSI, mechanical sirens, or wind-activated chimes, shall be permitted if the sound emitted is audible beyond the boundaries of the lot. Any noise complaints shall be evaluated in accordance with the municipal noise ordinances of the city of Sedona. I leaned forward, my eyes tracing the lines of text. There it was. The dependency. In software, a dependency is when one piece of code relies on another to function. If the secondary code is flawed, the primary code fails. The HOA bylaws didn't actually set a specific volume limit. They offloaded that responsibility to the city of Sedona's municipal noise ordinance. I opened a new tab and searched for the Sedona Municipal Code regarding residential noise limits. It didn't take long to find. Maximum permissible sound levels in residential zones during daytime hours, 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., shall not exceed 65 decibels, measured at the property line of the receiving land use. I stared at the letters DBA. Most people don't know anything about acoustic physics. Most people think a decibel is just a decibel. But working in tech, specifically in a previous life where I tested audio hardware for a gaming peripheral company, I knew better. There is a massive fundamental difference between dBA, A-weighted decibels, and dBc, C-weighted decibels. A-weighting, dBA, is the standard scale used by almost every police department, city council, and HOA in the country because it mimics human hearing. Human ears are very sensitive to mid-range frequencies, like a baby crying, a siren wailing, or a dog barking. But human ears are terrible at hearing very low frequencies. Therefore, the dBA scale aggressively filters out low-frequency bass. If you blast a high-pitched whistle, the dBA meter shoots up. If you play a deep, rumbling bass note that rattles the pictures on the wall, the dBA meter barely registers it. C-weighting, dBc, on the other hand, is a flat measurement. It measures the actual physical sound pressure in the air, regardless of whether a human ear is sensitive to it. It measures the physical energy of the sound wave. The Sedona Municipal Code specifically mandated the use of decibels, which meant, legally speaking, the city, and by extension, the HOA, was completely blind to low-frequency bass. I leaned back in my chair, a slow, malicious grin spreading across my face. Brenda had banned my chimes because they were an outdoor device that violated the noise ordinance. But what if they weren't outdoors? And what if the sound they produced was entirely concentrated in a frequency range that the law literally could not measure? I looked out the window at the heavy brass cylinders hanging from the pergola. They were beautiful, but they were limited by the natural wind. They had potential, but they needed an upgrade. They needed to be taken off the porch, brought inside, and transformed into a highly focused, legally unmeasurable instrument of absolute chaos. The malicious compliance blueprint was forming in my head, piece by piece. First, I needed to remove the chimes from the pergola, officially complying with the outdoor device ban. Second, I needed to hang them inside my sunroom, directly against the glass facing Brenda's house. Third, I needed a way to amplify their natural resonant frequency, that deep baritone hum, and pitch it down even further, pushing it entirely into the sub-bass frequency range. I opened Amazon and started adding things to my cart. Piezoelectric contact microphones, a massive high-velocity industrial oscillating fan, a heavy-duty guitar octave pedal capable of dropping a signal 2 full octaves. But I needed an amplifier, not just a regular speaker. I needed something capable of moving serious air, something built for low-end pressure. I picked up my phone and searched for local audio-visual contractors, guys who specialized in custom setups, live events, or home theater installations. I skipped past the polished, corporate-looking websites and found a bare-bones page for a local business called Desert Sonics. The contact photo was a guy who looked like he had roadied for Metallica in the late 80s and never quite recovered. I dialed the number. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. Desert Sonics, Buzz speaking. Hey, Buzz, I said, leaning forward on my desk. I have a somewhat unconventional project, and I need a professional. I do home theaters, PA systems, and acoustic paneling, man, Buzz said, sounding like he was currently chewing on a mouthful of gravel. I don't do car stereos, if that's what you're asking. It's not a car stereo, I replied. I need to take the acoustic resonance of a set of heavy brass wind chimes, mic them up, pitch them down 2 octaves, and pump the resulting signal through the largest, most aggressive bass amplifier you can legally sell me. And I need it installed inside my sunroom, pointing specifically at a vector 20 degrees north-northeast. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Buzz breathing heavily, processing the request. 20 degrees north-northeast, Buzz finally said, his voice dropping an octave. What's in that direction? My HOA president's living room. Another long silence. Then a low, rumbling chuckle came through the speaker. Wait, Buzz said, his tone shifting from bored contractor to suddenly highly invested co-conspirator. So you want to turn a gentle breeze into a localized, low-frequency earthquake? You want to weaponize the brass? Legally weaponize, I corrected. It has to stay under 65 decibels at the property line. That's crucial. Ah, Buzz said, catching on immediately. Awaited limits. You're going to bombard her with C-weighted physical pressure while staying invisible to the cops' A-weighted meters. I respect the hell out of that. Can you do it? Can I do it? Buzz snorted. Buddy, I've got a vintage 1970s Ampeg SVT 100-watt bass amp sitting in my garage right now. It's got an 8x10 cabinet. It's the size of a refrigerator. It moves so much air it can blow out a match from 10 feet away. If we hook your contact mics up to that and run it through a decent sub-octave generator, we won't just annoy her. We're going to vibrate the fillings right out of her teeth. When can you be here? I can be there tomorrow at 10 in the morning, Buzz said. My hourly rate is $80 plus parts. See you at 10, Buzz. I hung up the phone, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over me. I walked outside, untied the heavy brass wind chimes from the wooden pergola, and brought them inside. I carefully laid them out on the kitchen island, wiping down the brass. The next morning, promptly at 10 o'clock, a battered primer-gray Ford Econoline van pulled into my meticulously raked gravel driveway. The side of the van had Desert Sonics spray-painted on it using what looked like a custom stencil. Buzz stepped out. He was exactly as I pictured him. Tall, thin, wearing a faded Iron Maiden t-shirt, torn jeans, and a pair of heavily scuffed combat boots. His gray hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and he had a toothpick wedged in the corner of his mouth. He didn't bother knocking. He just walked up to the open garage door where I was waiting. "You the guy with the chimes?" he asked, not extending a hand. "I am," I said. "Let's see the layout." I walked him through the house and into the sunroom. The sunroom was a glass-enclosed patio attached to the back of the house, facing the property line. I pointed out the window to Brenda's house, indicating the massive custom double-paned picture window dominating her living room wall. "That's the target," I said. Buzz walked up to the glass, squinting through the desert glare. He took the toothpick out of his mouth and pointed it at her window. "That's a lot of glass," Buzz observed, his eyes scanning the frame. "Looks like standard insulated double pane, probably argon gas filled, strong against impact, terribly susceptible to resonant frequency." "Resonant frequency," I repeated. "You know your physics." "Buddy, I spent 10 years mixing front-of-house sound for doom metal bands," Buzz said, turning away from the window. "I know how to vibrate a building apart. Now, where are the chimes?" I led him to the kitchen island. Buzz approached the heavy brass cylinders like they were a sacred relic. He reached out, tapping the longest cylinder with his knuckle. It let out a deep, sustained thun. "Good mass," Buzz muttered, leaning his ear close to the metal. "Thick walls. These aren't cheap tourist garbage. These have some real tone." "They were my grandfather's." "He had good taste," Buzz said. "All right, here's the plan. We hang them from a reinforced hook in the ceiling of the sunroom, about 2 feet back from the glass. We wire individual piezoelectric contact mics to the inside of the 3 largest tubes. Contact mics don't pick up ambient noise. They only pick up the physical vibration of the metal. That means we don't get feedback from the amp." "Smart." "Then," Buzz continued, walking out to his van and returning with a heavy metal toolbox, "we run the mic signals into a mixing board, feed that into an analog octave pedal. I brought a Boss OC3, it tracks sub-bass beautifully, and we pump the whole mess into the Ampeg." Over the next 3 hours, my sunroom transformed from a quiet place to read a book into a highly specialized acoustic laboratory. Buzz worked with a frantic, focused energy. He drilled a heavy-duty lag bolt into a ceiling joist and hung the chimes. He carefully glued the tiny, disc-shaped contact microphones to the inner walls of the brass tubes, running the thin black wires up the suspension strings and along the ceiling. Then came the amp. It took both of us to wheel the Ampeg 8x10 cabinet out of his van and into the house. It was a behemoth. A monolithic tower of black Tolex and silver grill cloth, standing nearly 4 feet tall. We positioned it right up against the glass of the sunroom, angled exactly 20 degrees north-northeast, directly at Brenda's living room window. Buzz placed the amplifier head on top, a massive, heavy block of tubes and transformers. Finally, I brought in the high-velocity industrial oscillating fan I had ordered. We set it up on a small table in the corner of the room, pointing at the chimes. "All right," Buzz said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Everything is wired. We have power. We have signal. You ready to test the wind?" I walked over to the industrial fan and flipped the switch to medium. The massive metal blades spun to life, creating a concentrated wind tunnel inside the enclosed sunroom. The heavy brass cylinders began to sway. Slowly at first, then they collided. Clank. Immediately, a small red LED light on Buzz's mixing board flashed. "Signal is good," Buzz said, his fingers resting on the master volume slider of the Ampeg. "Engaging the octave pedal, dropping the pitch." He clicked a heavy metal foot switch on the floor. "Bringing up the master." Buzz slowly, meticulously pushed the master volume slider up. It didn't sound like a wind chime anymore. It didn't sound like anything natural. As the brass cylinders collided in the artificial wind, the contact mics picked up the vibration, the pedal dropped the pitch down into the abyss, and the monolithic Ampeg amplifier pushed it into the room. It was a deep, guttural, rhythmic throb. Wub, wub, wub. It was so low in frequency that I didn't just hear it in my ears. I felt it in the floorboards. I felt it in my shins. I felt the coffee in my stomach vibrate. It was like standing next to a massive diesel engine idling underground. "Oh my God," I breathed, looking at Buzz. Buzz had a massive, chaotic grin on his face. "That," he shouted over the low-frequency drone, "is pure, C-weighted acoustic pressure. It's peaking around 40 hertz. To a human ear, it just sounds like a distant hum. But structurally, it's pushing massive waves of air directly at her house." "Wait," I said, running out of the sunroom and grabbing a handheld digital decibel meter I had bought on Amazon. I rushed back in, stood right next to the glass, and looked at the screen. I set the meter to dBA. The screen read 52 decibels. I switched the meter to dBc. The screen instantly jumped, 94 decibels. "It's working!" I yelled, showing Buzz the meter. On the legal A-weighted scale, it's quieter than a normal conversation. But on the physical C-weighted scale, it's practically a jet engine. "Science, baby!" Buzz laughed, turning the master volume down and killing the fan. The silence that rushed back into the room felt heavy, like the pressure had suddenly dropped. I paid Buzz in cash. He packed up his tools, slapped me on the shoulder, and gave me one final piece of advice before getting back into his primer gray van. "Keep an eye on the glass, man," he warned, pointing a calloused finger at my sunroom window, then at Brenda's. "When you push that much low-end frequency at a solid object, it's going to find its resonant frequency. If those frequencies match up, things start moving in ways they aren't supposed to." "I'll be careful," I promised. Buzz drove away, leaving me alone with my newly constructed, entirely legal indoor acoustic pressure system. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Brenda's meditation group usually met on her back patio at 4 p.m. I checked my watch. It was 3:45 p.m. I made myself a fresh cup of coffee, walked into the sunroom, and sat down in a comfortable armchair right next to the monolithic amplifier. I looked out the glass. Sure enough, Brenda was out on her pristine, dust-free patio. She was unrolling pastel-colored yoga mats, arranging small crystals in a circle, and lighting a smudge stick of sage. 3 other women in matching athleisure wear were sitting in a semicircle, eyes closed, hands resting on their knees. It looked incredibly peaceful. It looked harmonious. I reached over and flipped the switch on the industrial oscillating fan. The heavy brass chimes began to sway. They collided. I reached down and pushed the master volume slider on the Ampeg up to exactly halfway. The low-frequency drone instantly filled my sunroom. Wub, 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 wub. The floorboards vibrated. The glass in my sunroom window trembled slightly under my fingertips. I watched Brenda. For the first 10 seconds, she didn't react. The sound was too low, too ambient to immediately register as a threat. But then I saw it. One of the women in the meditation circle opened her eyes and looked down at her hands. She rubbed her chest, looking confused. Brenda stopped waving the sage stick. She tilted her head, like a dog trying to locate a high-pitched whistle, except this was the exact opposite. She was trying to locate a vibration. Brenda looked at her patio table. The glass of ice water sitting on it was vibrating. Tiny, concentric ripples were dancing across the surface of the water, perfectly synced to the rhythm of my wind chimes. Brenda stood up. She looked left. She looked right. She looked at the sky. She couldn't hear a loud noise, but she was trapped inside an invisible, pulsating pressure wave. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid vibrate slightly against my teeth, and smiled. The malicious compliance was fully operational. It took exactly 22 minutes for the police to arrive. I saw the cruiser pull up to the front curb through my living room window. I didn't turn off the fan. I didn't turn down the amp. I just walked to the front door, opened it, and waited. The same tired-looking officer from the beginning of the story walked up my driveway, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. Brenda was right behind him, practically hyperventilating, her pastel pink tracksuit looking less harmonious and more frantic. "Good afternoon, officer," I said politely. "Sir," the cop said, stopping at the edge of my porch. "We received a complaint of industrial machinery operating on the premises." "Industrial machinery?" I acted shocked, putting a hand to my chest. "In Whispering Canyons? Surely not. That would be a clear violation of Section 6 regarding home-based businesses." "He's doing it!" Brenda shrieked, pushing past the cop and pointing a finger at my face. "I don't know what it is, but the ground is shaking. My teeth are vibrating. He's using some kind of sonic weapon because I told him to take down his chimes." "Ma'am, please step back," the cop sighed, stepping between us. He looked at me. "Are you operating any heavy machinery, sir?" "No, officer," I said calmly. "I am simply running a fan in my sunroom and enjoying some ambient background noise. My grandfather's antique wind chimes, actually. I moved them indoors to strictly comply with the HOA's rule against outdoor noise-making devices." "They're indoors?" the cop asked. "Yes, sir, completely enclosed." "He's lying!" Brenda yelled. "Just listen! You can feel it!" The cop paused. He stood still on my porch. He closed his eyes for a second. I do feel a slight vibration," the cop admitted, looking down at his boots. "Like a truck idling a block away." "Exactly!" Brenda cried triumphantly. "Ticket him! Arrest him! Confiscate the machine!" "Hold on, Brenda," I said, raising a finger. Officer, what is the municipal noise ordinance limit for daytime hours in a residential zone? The cop blinked, surprised I knew the code. 65 decibels. Measured in what scale, sir? dBA. Do you have a decibel meter on you? The cop reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, yellow, handheld device. Standard issue. Would you mind taking a reading right here, at the property line? I gestured to the edge of the porch. The cop looked at Brenda, who was practically vibrating with righteous anger, then looked at me, completely calm and cooperative. He held up the meter and pressed the button. We all stared at the small digital screen. The numbers fluctuated slightly as a car drove past a block away, then settled. 58.2 decibels. The cop looked at the screen, tapped it with his thumb, and looked again. 58.1 decibels. Well, the cop said, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he lowered the device. The meter reads 58 decibels. The legal limit is 65. He is well under the legal limit. Brenda stared at the meter like it had just insulted her mother. That thing is broken, she screamed. You can feel it. My water glass was vibrating. Ma'am, the cop said, his patience visibly evaporating in the dry Arizona heat. The law is the law. The city code is based on A-weighted decibels. According to my city-issued equipment, this property is currently quieter than a normal conversation. I cannot write a citation for a noise violation if there is no noise violation. But my teeth, she shrieked. I'm sorry, ma'am, the cop replied, deadpan, delivering the line that would sustain my soul for years to come. I can't write a ticket for vibrating teeth. He turned to me. Have a good day, sir. You too, officer, I smiled. The cop walked back to his cruiser, got in, and drove away without looking back. Brenda stood on my porch, alone. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute fury and utter confusion. She knew I was doing it. I knew she knew I was doing it. But the law, the very system she used to terrorize the neighborhood, was explicitly telling her that nothing was happening. I leaned against the door frame, took a sip of my coffee, and smiled. Have a harmonious day, Brenda, I said softly, and closed the front door right in her face. For the next 3 weeks, a very specific, highly localized psychological war was waged over the property line between my house and Brenda's. Honestly, I didn't even have to run the system all day. I'm not a monster, and frankly, leaving a vintage 100-watt tube amplifier running unattended for 8 hours a day is a massive fire hazard. Plus, the electricity bill would have been astronomical. So I put the industrial oscillating fan and the Ampeg on a very specific, very petty schedule. I literally bought a pair of smart plugs off Amazon and synced them to my phone. Whenever I saw Brenda step out onto her patio, whether it was for her morning matcha tea, her afternoon yoga session, or just to stand there and silently judge the neighborhood, I would pull out my phone, open the app, and tap a button labeled Harmonious Vibes. Inside the sunroom, the fan would instantly whir to life. The heavy brass chimes would collide. The contact mics would catch the impact, the octave pedal would pitch it down to a demonic rumble, and the Ampeg would push a solid wall of 40 Hz C-weighted acoustic pressure directly at her house. I mean, it was like clockwork. She would step outside, take a deep breath of the crisp Sedona air, and suddenly, the invisible thrumming would begin. Wub, wub, wub. I'd sit at my kitchen island with my laptop, watching through the window as her shoulders would immediately tense up. She'd look around, swatting at the air like there was an invisible swarm of bees hovering around her head. She'd move her water glass, trying to stop the surface from rippling. She'd aggressively reposition her lawn chairs. After about 10 minutes, she would inevitably give up, pack up her yoga mat, and storm back inside, slamming her sliding glass door so hard, I'm surprised it didn't shatter right then and there. She called the cops 3 more times that first week. Every single time, they sent the same exhausted, hollow-eyed patrol officer. Every single time, he stood on my porch, pulled out his yellow decibel meter, and recorded a perfectly legal, A-weighted reading of somewhere between 55 and 60 decibels. By the 4th visit, he didn't even bother knocking on my door. I just saw him pull up, stand in Brenda's driveway while she yelled and pointed at my house, check his meter, shrug his shoulders, and drive away. I guess the Sedona Police Department eventually put a note on her file, because after the 2nd week, they stopped responding to her noise complaints entirely. That's when she tried to escalate things internally. She started slipping passive-aggressive notes into my mailbox. They were all written on official Whispering Canyon's HOA letterhead, typed out in a font that looked suspiciously like Comic Sans, and signed with her loopy, aggressive signature. Your continued defiance of community standards will not be tolerated. The board is monitoring the situation. We are aware of your mechanical sonic device. Cease and desist immediately or face extreme financial penalties. Your vibrations are killing my prize-winning agave plant. I took every single note, filed them away in a manila folder labeled Brenda's Manifestos, and went right back to my smart plug app. But as the 3rd week rolled around, the weather in Sedona started to shift. A massive, low-pressure system rolled in from the west, bringing with it a steady, driving wind that whipped through the canyons and howled around the houses. I didn't need the industrial fan that weekend. The natural wind was more than enough to keep the chimes moving. And since I had explicitly moved the chimes indoors to comply with Brenda's outdoor device ban, I had to keep the windows of the sunroom cracked open just enough to let the breeze in. Otherwise, it wouldn't be authentic, right? Saturday afternoon was when things reached a critical mass. The wind was blowing at a sustained 30 miles an hour. Inside the sunroom, the heavy brass cylinders were practically dancing. They were colliding with massive, heavy impacts. The contact mics were sending a continuous, frantic signal to the Boss OC3 octave pedal, which was struggling to process the sheer volume of low-frequency data. I had the Ampeg's master volume pushed slightly higher than usual, maybe to a 6 out of 10. I honestly wasn't trying to break anything. I was just trying to see how much physical pressure the system could maintain without the amp's tubes overheating. But I had underestimated the physics of resonant frequency. Buzz, my eccentric audiovisual contractor, had warned me about this. Every single physical object in the universe has a natural resonant frequency, a specific pitch at which it naturally vibrates. If you expose an object to an external sound wave that perfectly matches its natural frequency, the object will absorb that energy and vibrate sympathetically. If you pump enough energy into that matching frequency, the vibration builds on itself, amplifying until the material can no longer withstand the physical stress. It's how an opera singer shatters a wine glass. And apparently Brenda's massive, custom-built, developer-grade, argon-filled, double-paned living room picture window had a natural resonant frequency that exactly matched a pitched-down, heavy brass wind chime resonating at roughly 42 hertz. I was sitting in my living room, trying to debug a particularly nasty line of code for work, when I heard it. It wasn't an explosion. It didn't sound like a bomb going off. It sounded like a massive, frozen lake cracking under the weight of a truck. Cray-crack. The sound was so loud, so sharp and structural, that I literally jumped out of my ergonomic desk chair, knocking my cold brew over onto the rug. I scrambled to the window, peering out toward the property line. Over at Brenda's house, the scene was absolute, glorious chaos. The massive picture window dominating her living room wall wasn't just broken, it had completely failed. The outer pane of the double-glazed glass had shattered entirely, spiderwebbing into a million tiny, opaque fractures from corner to corner. The sheer physical tension of the glass had caused the center of the pane to buckle outward, sending a cascade of sharp, jagged glass shards raining down onto her meticulously manicured bed of drought-resistant succulents. Brenda was standing on her front lawn, wearing a silk bathrobe, clutching her head with both hands. Her mouth was open in a silent scream. She was staring at the window, then staring at my house, then staring back at the window. I honestly felt a tiny, fleeting ping of guilt for about half a second. But then I remembered the 60-page HOA manifesto, the laminated yellow citation slip, and the sheer entitlement it took to try and ban my grandfather's chimes over a slight breeze. The guilt instantly evaporated, replaced by a deep, profound sense of technical satisfaction. The trap had closed. The malicious compliance had reached its physical conclusion. I immediately walked into the sunroom, turned off the Ampeg amplifier, unplugged the octave pedal, and closed the sunroom windows. The deep, thrumming vibration that had dominated the property line for weeks abruptly ceased, leaving behind a deafening, heavy silence. I didn't go outside. I didn't gloat. I just calmly cleaned up my spilled coffee, sat back down at my laptop, and waited for the inevitable fallout. It didn't take long. Less than 48 hours later, a certified letter arrived via courier. I had to sign for it at the door. It was an official summons from the Whispering Canyons Homeowners Association Board of Directors. It stated that an emergency disciplinary hearing had been scheduled for that Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. My presence was mandatory. The letter accused me of gross negligence, intentional destruction of private property, and violating the harmonious aesthetic of the community. It outlined that the board would be seeking full financial restitution for the replacement of a $3,200 custom window, plus immediate legal expulsion from the neighborhood. They were bringing the hammer down. Thursday evening arrived, and I drove my car down to the community clubhouse. It was a faux adobe building sitting next to the neighborhood pool, smelling heavily of chlorine and stale coffee. I walked in, carrying nothing but a slim, black leather portfolio tucked under my arm. The meeting room was arranged like a tribunal. 5 long folding tables had been pushed together to form a barrier at the front of the room. Sitting behind the tables were the 5 members of the HOA board. Brenda sat dead center, looking like an absolute thundercloud in a sharp business professional navy suit. To her left was Gary, the HOA secretary, a nervous-looking guy with a terrible comb-over who furiously clicked a ballpoint pen. The other 3 members were elderly retirees who looked like they mostly just enjoyed the feeling of having authority over their neighbor's trash can placement. Sitting off to the side, separated from the board, was a guy in a very expensive, tailored gray suit. He had a legal pad in front of him and looked incredibly bored. I immediately clocked him as the HOA's retained counsel. The lawyer. This was the guy I actually had to convince. The emergency session of the Whispering Canyons Homeowners Association is now called to order, Brenda announced, slamming a small wooden gavel onto the folding table. She glared at me, her eyes practically vibrating with hatred. We are here to address the malicious, destructive, and frankly terrifying actions of the resident residing at Lot 42. She stood up, dramatically gesturing to a poster board she had set up on an easel next to the table. It was a blown-up, high-resolution photograph of her shattered living room window. "This," she said, her voice trembling with theatrical indignation, "is what happened to my property this past Saturday. A custom, argon-insulated double-paned window, utterly destroyed by a sustained, targeted sonic assault originating from his property." She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "He weaponized a machine to vibrate my house apart. It is property damage. It is vandalism. And the board is prepared to seek maximum legal and financial penalties, including foreclosure of his property for violating community safety standards." The 3 elderly board members gasped on cue. Gary furiously scribbled in his notebook. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Brenda demanded, gripping the edges of the folding table. "Before we vote to authorize our legal counsel to file suit?" I stood up from my folding chair. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't act angry. I acted like I was explaining a very simple math problem to a very slow student. "I have a few things to say, Brenda," I said, unzipping my black leather portfolio and pulling out a stack of neatly stapled documents. "First of all, I want to express my deepest sympathies regarding your window. It looks like a terrible structural failure. Have you contacted the manufacturer about a warranty claim?" "Don't play games with me," she snapped. "You broke it." "Did I?" I asked innocently. "I haven't set foot on your property. I haven't thrown a rock. I haven't fired a projectile." "You used a machine!" "I used an indoor personal fan and a commercially available audio amplifier to quietly enjoy my late grandfather's wind chimes within the enclosed privacy of my own home," I corrected, walking forward and placing the first document on the table in front of the bored-looking lawyer. "This," I said, tapping the paper, "is Section 4, Paragraph B of the Whispering Canyon's Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the rule you cited me for. It explicitly bans outdoor noise-making devices. I complied. I brought the chimes indoors. They are legally an indoor furnishing." "They were hooked up to a speaker," Brenda yelled. "Which is also indoors," I replied smoothly. "Now, as for the accusation of a sonic assault, let's look at the actual lumusum, legally binding metrics governing noise in this community." I handed a second document to the lawyer. He picked it up, finally looking slightly interested. "That is a printout of the municipal noise ordinance for the city of Sedona, which the HOA bylaws explicitly defer to," I explained to the room. "The ordinance states that daytime residential noise cannot exceed 65 decibels at the property line, period. That is the only legal metric that matters." I pulled out a third stack of papers, 3 official police reports I had requested from the city clerk's office that morning. I handed them out to the board members. "These are the sworn incident reports from the 3 separate times Brenda called the Sedona Police Department to investigate my property," I said, my voice cutting through the silent room like a knife. "On all 3 occasions, law enforcement officers stood at the property line, used calibrated city-issued decibel meters, and recorded sound levels between 55 and 60 dBA, well under the legal limit. In the eyes of the law, and therefore in the eyes of this HOA, my property was operating quietly and legally." "But the vibrations!" Brenda shrieked, slamming her hand on the table. "The glass shattered. You can't just shatter a window and get away with it." "Glass shatters for a lot of reasons, Brenda," I said, looking her dead in the eye. "Thermal stress, poor installation, or occasionally a phenomenon known as resonant frequency, where ambient environmental factors coincidentally align with the structural weakness of the glass itself. I turned my attention entirely to the lawyer in the gray suit. "Counselor," I said, my tone shifting to pure, cold business. "Let's strip away the emotion here. What we have is a homeowner attempting to use the HOA to sue another homeowner for property damage based on an alleged noise violation. However, the accused homeowner has explicit, documented proof from local law enforcement that no noise violation occurred because the city code relies entirely on A-weighted decibel limits, which aggressively filter out low-frequency sound pressure." The lawyer stared at me. I could see the gears turning in his head. He looked down at the HOA bylaws, then at the city code, then at the police reports. "Furthermore," I continued, "if the board pursues a lawsuit or attempts to levy a fine against me, you will be doing so without a single shred of actionable legal evidence. You have no citations. You have no failed decibel readings. All you have is a broken window and a theory about physics that the municipal code does not recognize." I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the folding table. "If you sue me, I will countersue the HOA for harassment, selective enforcement, and legal fees, and I will win on a motion for summary judgment because your own foundational documents prove I followed the rules to the letter. I complied with the outdoor ban. I complied with the decibel limit. I am legally untouchable." The room was dead silent. The only sound was the hum of the clubhouse refrigerator in the corner. Brenda looked at the lawyer, expecting him to object, to tear my argument apart, to do something. The lawyer sighed. He took off his expensive reading glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at Brenda. "He's right, Brenda," the lawyer said quietly. "What?" Brenda gasped, looking like she had just been physically struck. "What do you mean he's right? He broke my window." "He exploited a massive loophole in the municipal code regarding DBA versus DBC weighting," the lawyer explained, his voice laced with grudging professional respect. "He generated low-frequency sound waves that vibrate matter without registering as loud to the human ear, or more importantly, to the cops' A-weighted meters. Because our bylaws defer to the city code, and the city code only measures dBA, he has technically broken no rules. If we take this to court, a judge will throw it out. We have no grounds. He has a paper trail of police reports proving he was within the legal limits." "But my window," Brenda whispered, her face draining of color. "Call your insurance company," the lawyer advised, packing up his legal pad. "Tell them it was an act of God, or a freak gust of wind, because legally the HOA cannot help you here." Gary, the secretary, looked terrified. The three elderly board members were whispering furiously to each other. Brenda just sat there, staring at the blown-up photograph of her ruined custom glass. The absolute, unshakable authority she thought she wielded over the neighborhood had just been systematically dismantled by a guy with a guitar amp and an understanding of municipal dependency structures. "So," I said, zipping up my black leather portfolio and tucking it back under my arm, "unless there is any further business regarding my legally compliant indoor wind chimes, I'm going to head home. I have some code to debug." No one said a word. I turned around and walked out of the clubhouse, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind me. The aftermath was glorious. Brenda tried to file a claim with her homeowner's insurance, but unfortunately for her, she had opted for a cheaper policy that specifically excluded structural glass failure not resulting from direct physical impact or extreme weather. The insurance company categorized the shattering as a bizarre instance of environmental resonance and denied the claim. She had to pay the entire $200 out of pocket to have a specialized glass company come out, remove the shattered frame, and install a brand new, non-custom window. The week after the new window was installed, Brenda officially resigned as the president of the Whispering Canyons Homeowners Association, citing health reasons and neighborhood hostility. Gary took over, and his first act as president was to effectively stop enforcing any rule that didn't involve blatant criminal activity. He was too terrified of getting legally outmaneuvered to even care if someone left their trash cans out an extra day. As for me, I kept my promise. I didn't want to be a nuisance. I just wanted to prove a point. The day after the HOA meeting, I called Buzz, the eccentric audio contractor, and paid him another $80 to come over and help me dismantle the Ampeg and the contact microphones. We wheeled the massive cabinet back out to his primer gray van. "Shame to see it go," Buzz laughed, leaning against the van with his signature toothpick in his mouth. "That was a truly majestic acoustic weapon, a real masterpiece of localized warfare." "It served its purpose, Buzz," I smiled, shaking his hand. "Thanks for the expertise." I moved the heavy brass chimes back outside, hanging them securely from the wooden pergola over my back patio, right where they belonged. I didn't get any more citations. I didn't get any more passive-aggressive notes on Comic Sans letterhead. I just got to sit on my patio in the evenings, drinking my cold brew, watching the sun set over the towering red rocks of Sedona, and listening to the deep, resonant, legally compliant hum of my grandfather's antique brass. If you're going to write the rules, you better make sure you understand the physics behind them. Because the moment you try to use a technicality to ruin someone else's piece, you open the door for them to use a bigger, louder, sub-bass technicality to shatter yours. Keep your bylaws tight, keep your resonance in check, and never mess with a QA tester who has too much free time. Have a good one.